All right, good morning, saints. As we were singing that last song, I went a little bilingual up on the front row. But, one of the greatest versions of that song that's out now is it's not currently out, it's been out for a while. The one that they sometimes play on the radio that it just jumps languages? And it goes from English to Spanish to Arabic. That's what we have to look forward to. We have a time coming up when every tribe, every nation will have a representative from all the nations of the world will be there singing to the Messiah in Jerusalem together. It's something the world is yet to see. It's something particular to the law of Messiah. There's a book coming out soon talking about the difference between the Torah of Moses and the Torah of the Messiah. There's some irony in that, in who gave the law to Moses, that he may have set something up with a deliberate temporary nature just to give us a tutor, if you will, the way Galatians 3 says, to this new thing that he's bringing. And it leads unto this time when in the future in Jerusalem, and thereafter, where all nations of the earth, every tribe, every tongue will sing to God how great he is. And at one time, the nations of the earth, including Israel, as they turned away from God, turned toward paganism and anything but God. Anything but the God of the Bible. What a wonderful thing we have to look forward to in the future. Meanwhile, while we're here, you have to listen to me for an hour. Okay, good. Good to hear. Whew. I had nobody on deck, so thank you. All right, so today we're going to start the book of Hebrews, and we're going to go through the background of this today, and more importantly, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the background. We're going to start talking about the intent of why this letter was written. It's an epistle letter by church tradition. It actually doesn't say Hebrews anywhere in the letter. By church tradition, this was written to Jewish believers. And so there's a couple of manuscripts that say written to the Hebrews from Italy at the very end. And they're later manuscripts, and that's been the tradition. And as we go through the content, we'll see that if they weren't Jewish believers, they definitely knew something about the temple. And they definitely knew the law of Moses. And there's some reason that this writer has to make these arguments to them. But today we're going to look at the reason why that is, because it is a 2,000-year-old problem. Probably goes back before 2,000 years. This is probably something Israel also struggled with, even back to the time of the first temple. So before we get into this concept, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I pray that you illuminate our minds. I pray that your Spirit guides us in the little bit that we're going to be interacting with the text to truly understand the thesis statement of the author to the reader. As to why this letter was written, Lord, I pray that we understand that this letter was not meant to be complex. The more complex this letter is, the more it shows us as saints that we have not dove into your word at the depth that you require of us. Lord, guide us in that. Let this study over the coming months motivate us toward understanding that there is so much in your scriptures that you have disclosed to humanity, and sometimes we only nick the surface. But Lord, don't let us create a culture of just nicking the surface. Don't let us be perpetual babies. I ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so the letter to the Hebrews. Author. So who wrote it? We have no idea. All right, done. Thanks. No. We have no idea who wrote the letter of Hebrews. There's some ideas from the text that we can deduce that we know it has to be one of about 4 to 5 men that may have written this. So in Hebrews 13, at the very end of the letter, as the author's closing up, he says this: I strongly urge you, brothers, endure this word of encouragement So he calls this letter just a brief word of encouragement. I have written only to you a few words. So those of you who have read Hebrews or did the study on living by the book, you're like, a few words? Right? But he says that this is basics. I've only written to you a few words. You should know, now this is some of the indicators as to who the author might be. You should know that our brother Timothy, so it's somebody who knows Timothy, has been released, with whom I shall see you if he comes soon. So whoever this is knew Timothy. And we know that the Apostle Paul was the one in Acts 16 who discovered Timothy. Timothy was the son of a Jewish mother and a Greek father. His father, by default of being Greek, by every indication of the text, he was most likely a pagan. He was a polytheist that was married to a Jewish woman. She was God-fearing, and we know that she was God-fearing, and it sounds like her family was God-fearing. And she raised Timothy in the text of the Old Testament. She raised him in the Jewish scriptures. But it's the father's job to make your boy Jewish on the 8th day. So if you're Jewish and you have a son, on the 8th day, you're going to the moil. He didn't have a father who did that, so we know that Paul did that for him. Paul, in Timothy, in his old age, he definitely remembers his bris. He wasn't 8 days old, and Paul actually performed the bris. Paul was a Pharisee from the Sanhedrin. He was licensed to do that. And so he actually performed a bris for Timothy because Timothy was one of those in-between cases. Was he Jewish or was he a Gentile? And Paul looks at him and goes, you're raised in the scriptures. Your mom's from the people of Israel. You are part of the house of Israel. And so he carries that out. But we know that Timothy has traveled with Paul. He's been there with Paul, but other people were with Paul as well. So this is part of Paul's circle from what we can see here, but we also have this. Those who come from Italy send you greetings. Grace be with you all. So it's either Paul, this is just by logical deduction, or someone in Paul's ministry that knows Timothy. So it's somebody in that circle. So it's high-level Greek. So this Greek is really high-level, like the letter of Jude. Those of you who went through the Jude study, we saw that Jesus and his brothers were very highly educated in the Greek language. Despite being poor, they had a very high-level writing of Greek. The letter of James is very high-level Greek. And so is this letter. And we know that Paul sometimes can write in high-level Greek. Now, Paul is also the king of conversational run-on sentence Greek, where you have to put a period at the end of the paragraph. And in between, it's a world of commas and semicolons. And if you pick up a couple of English Bibles, they never punctuate Paul's letters the same, except around the pastoral epistles. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, he tends to hold to this high-level Greek. But the other person who always writes in high-level Greek is Luke. So those of you in the Acts study, in the first hour, Acts and the Gospel of Luke, the 2-volume set, very high-level Greek. And so Luke could be a candidate because this is the grammar that Luke loves to write in. He tends to stay there. It could also be Paul. Similar. Now the vocabulary is similar to what Paul uses in Colossians and in 1 and 2 Corinthians and several other letters. So if this person isn't Paul that wrote it, it's someone who uses Paul's vocabulary. They use a lot of it, and as we progress, we're going to see that when Paul says something over in Colossians, the writer of Hebrews says it the exact same thing in a more elaborate manner. And it's very interesting that the two of them kind of bounce off one another this way. So these are the candidates from church history. Paul, Luke, Barnabas, because Barnabas went with Paul's first missionary journey. He would have known Timothy. Silas, also known as Silvanus in Peter's letters, and Apollo. The only problem is the last three guys, we don't have any of their writings to compare them with. So usually Paul and Luke are the top two. But we do know whoever this is most likely a diaspora Jew, someone that lives in the Greek-speaking world, and they may be writing to Israel. We don't know. It could be to the Jewish populace who goes to and from Jerusalem. But Origen said this. He says, only God knows, in the 2nd century, only God knows who truly wrote Hebrews. And that's true. We truly don't know who wrote it. We know in 95 AD, Clement quotes Hebrews, like whole blocks of it, so we know this letter existed before 95 AD. So we're back in the 1st century. So this is a famous picture. Does anyone know where this is from? Has anyone ever heard of Titus's Arch in Rome? Anyone been to Rome? No one's been to Rome. Okay. So in Rome, there's an arch not too far from the Colosseum that Titus, who was the general who pulled the second temple down, he had an arch erected, and this is the image across the top of the arch, and it's the Romans bringing the vestments back from the temple. And so when some people say that Jews didn't live in Israel in the first century, you get that now in the liberal media, it's actually written in stone that they lived in the first century. Okay? And so the things on the right are the silver trumpets, and there's the menorah. You can see the menorah clear as day. And these were getting brought back to Rome as part of the triumphal entry of Titus under his father Vespasian after having conquered Jerusalem. So this took place in 70 AD on the 9th of Av in the Jewish calendar. It's the same day that the Babylonians pulled down the first temple. So we know this letter had to exist before the Jewish war. So 66 is when the war starts. The war ends in 70. And so the reason we can deduce that is whoever's writing Hebrews is talking about the temple practices as if they're still going on. So there's still sacrifice, there's still Yom Kippur occurring every year. He mentions that. And all of that stopped in 66 AD with the war. And so whoever's writing this is writing to Jewish believers most likely before the Jewish war. So we start getting back a little further. Early 50s. So this Acts 18, this takes place in the early 50s AD in the book of Acts. It says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. So here's Paul's missionary journeys. He found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. It's a really weird name. I had uncles named Aquila. It's a very strange name. Recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. That is not the wife of Elvis. Because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So now we have Jews leaving Italy. So this is starting to make sense with Hebrews 13. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, so Paul's of the same trade as Priscilla and Aquila, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers. So all three of them made tents. And it says he reasoned in the synagogue every Shabbat and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy, so here's that group around Paul, arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. So everywhere Paul went, he went to the synagogue first, and and a couple people would believe, they'd come and talk with him throughout the week. But every Shabbat, he'd go into the synagogue and he would try to make a case on Shabbat when he knew that most of the Jews had gathered. That's really why he was doing it. He knew that was his best chance to get the word out, that Jesus of Nazareth was the Jewish Messiah. Many rejected him, but some Jews believed, some Gentiles believed, and that really is how he set up the church in any area, is as he went around telling people about this Jewish Messiah. Even some of the former polytheistic Greeks were embracing him. They were actually leaving polytheism behind and saying, yeah, we'll believe in the Jewish God. We didn't know this about him. And so that mix of Jew-Gentile is really where we get the assemblies of the churches as he went on his missionary journeys. So this book, this letter, is probably written in the early 60s. It's probably written after this, but before the Jewish war. Okay? So that's a really hot time in the history of the church. 62 AD is when James was killed, Jesus' brother. So the Sanhedrin is trying people. They're killing people at the time. They're killing their own. They're starting to have internal conflicts between the Zealots and the Sadducees. They're committing assassinations and murders. The Christians are caught up in it. The believers are caught up in the midst of that. And there's obviously in tandem with that, in tandem with the violence, they're sending, as we saw in Jude, they're sending groups to try and convince people of what? Jesus is not the Messiah. This is not true. And so they're in the middle of this battle, and the writer of Hebrews is trying to reassure them, along with Jude, trying to reassure them it is 100% true. The letter of Jude, the whole reason he wrote that letter was to give a case from the book of Moses that Jesus is the promised Messiah. With Hebrews, it's a much more elaborate form, but it's essentially the same intended goal. So before we go forward, that's all the background of Hebrews. I said we're not going to sit too deep in the background, just because the author is ambiguous. But why was Hebrews written? Okay, so why do I have a picture up here of this big, beautiful feast? Does that make anybody hungry? Okay, none of you have been to Rome, but then all the hands go up with the food. Got it, okay. I know who my Baptists are. Thank you. Saw the hands. I saw that hand. Anyway. So why was Hebrews written? If I laid a feast, now think about this. If I laid a feast in front of you and said, eat up, would you want to do that? Would you want to sit and grab a fork and a knife? If I gave you roasted, what do we got here? I'll take my glasses off. I've got some roasted lamb. We'll call it beef for all of you anti-lamb people. So we got some roasted beef. That's we'll call it Middle East beef. Does that help? Okay. Yeah, we'll call it Middle East beef. We've got some roasted veggies on the right. I see some asparagus, some roasted potatoes. You can keep the Brussels sprouts on the left. Those are a gift from my pantry to you. And then we've got some seasonings and stuff down on the bottom. That plate on the bottom, those of you who have been to a Seder, what is that? That's the Passover plate. You see that? It's got all the, it's got the charoset on there. It's got the karpas, the celery, and the parsley. So think about Passover for a minute. If you go to a Passover dinner at somebody's house, do you walk away hungry? You miss the boat if you walked away hungry from any Jewish feast. Okay? Doesn't matter if it's from 1400 BC or this past April. Can't believe we're in May now. This past April, if you go to a Jewish dinner and walk away hungry and wanting, you were probably not at a Jewish dinner. Okay? And so, or maybe they were vegans, I don't know. But why was Hebrews written? Did you know that Hebrews is written around the concept of a feast? And I don't mean a Jewish feast like the fulfillment of Passover, even though that's in there. It's written around the concept of something that Jewish people do 52 weeks a year and on 7 holidays at a minimum. So every Shabbat, every Friday evening, you light candles, you cook food, you pull apart the challah bread. Everyone know what challah bread is? It's great stuff, right? You pull apart the challah bread and you eat and you sit and talk with family once a week. That's really what Shabbat's for. It's not for going to synagogue. Synagogue was added later. You actually sit at home with family. And then on the 7 holidays that are called out in Leviticus, you're supposed to either go to Jerusalem or do something at home, right? And in both instances, you eat. You eat. They tried to kill us. God delivered us. Let's eat, right? So why was it written? It was written around a feast. And we're going to go through this today because what the writer of Hebrews is saying to his crowd, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse here, but he's saying it is as if God is laying a feast in front of you and you don't know what to do with it. And we're going to elaborate on that as we go because there's a reason they don't know what to do with it. They sat in a mentality that the writer of Hebrews is trying to get them out of. And that's really the thesis, if you will, of the whole letter, of the point of why he's writing. So here's a great example of some images from Passover. And when I looked these up, they said they were AI images. I guess these people are fake. I don't know how AI works. But on the right, okay, so 2 things you do on Passover. This is just one feast of several, right? There's 2 things we do. We tell the story, okay, and eat the food. If anyone says, what do you do on a Passover dinner? You tell the story and you eat the food. Of course, there's steps to that, right? But you should not walk away hungry. So we tell the story. So on the right-hand side, we have a dad with his son to his right hand, which would be where the young lad asking the 4 questions would sit. And he tells the story, and they eat as they go. And the eating is almost like an appetizer for the dinner. But then when the dinner comes, you eat the food. If you're not eating the food, you're not doing the thing that God tells you to do. And God commands you to eat. I don't see the loss of benefit there, right? There's always a benefit to eating. So if we go back thousands of years, now on the right-hand side is a picture of Jesus feasting with the apostles. And then we have Middle Ages, modern times, This is always true from Moses forward, is that when you gather together, there's really, even on Yom Kippur, even though you fast all day, once the time of fasting's over, what do? You go out and get Chinese, right? That's a very ancient custom that dates back to 1958 in Brooklyn. But you go out and you eat. That's when we break the fast, we go and eat. That's where the word breakfast comes from, breaking the fast, right? So you never break fast by munching on crackers. You go out and you have a good meal, okay? So this is a common theme throughout the whole of Scripture. And we talked about this with the biblical tithe. The tithe was there to make sure everyone in Israel doesn't go hungry, right? Everybody has means, everybody has food. Who are the people? Now we have to ask ourselves this. Who are the people who don't benefit from a feast? That almost sounds illogical, but there are people who don't benefit from me laying down a giant plate, a big spread, right? If we're going to talk in Christian terms, coming to a potluck and walking away hungry, right? People who don't benefit from that, okay? And like I said, we're kind of light in the passage, but we're going to get to the key point of Hebrews so that we study it correctly moving forward. But the first people who don't benefit from a feast are those who refuse to eat. Plain and simple. If you sit down and refuse to eat, you're going to walk away hungry. Okay? That's the first one. Those who refuse to eat. And you get those people, right? You could give them a spread. It's not gluten-free. They're on a celery diet, which has no nutritional value, right? And they refuse to eat. Well, they're not going to benefit from sitting at the table. This is important to understand. So that's the first group, those who refuse to eat. The second group, and there is another group, people who don't benefit from a feast. And this should be obvious if you're a parent. If you have a baby at a big feast, does the newborn, does that little one over there care about what you guys have on the table? Not at all, right? Right? The fork may make noise, but that's about it. If you're Kira, the fork still makes noise, right? But they don't care what's on the table. They care if the bottle comes out, right? When we had Brianna, we had to bottle feed her. She was in the NICU when she was first born for about, 2 weeks? 3 weeks? Oh, wow, 3 weeks. And she lived off the bottle because at the same time, Valerie was receiving magnesium treatments for blood pressure. Is that right? She couldn't go upstairs to nurse Brianna. And so the baby lived off the bottle. It did not take long, even as a newborn, that when the baby saw the bottle or felt the bottle, that it's eating time, right? I could lay a steak in front of Bria until she was 3. She's not going to do anything with it, right? And so those who don't benefit from a feast, this is the second logical ones that don't, is the people who cannot feed themselves. They can't feed themselves. Not only do they not know what to do with the food, they don't know what to do with the utensils. This is if you're a parent, for a while you cut the steak for the kid, right? They're never going to learn, or you don't want them to use the steak knife because they start waving it around. So you cut the steak. And in Indian culture, they will take, I remember Valerie and her siblings talking about this, but when you're really young in Indian culture, getting used to using naan bread to eat curry, the parents will actually scoop it up onto the pieces of naan and feed it to the kid, getting them used to ripping off the naan, scooping it, and eating it, getting them used to using naan, roti, chapati bread, all that stuff. But this is the age of kids or of humans where they cannot feed themselves. They'll never benefit from a feast. Mom and dad will, as long as they get to eat, right? But those kids, what do? They sit at the high chair and they wait for the bottle. And 9 times out of 10, it's not just bottle fed. They got to wait on mom, right? If you're a nursing mother, they got to wait on mom, where they truly can't feed themselves because mom is the food source. That's a big deal. If mom's not there and the bottle's not there, what happens? they don't eat, right? So that's the second group who cannot feed themselves. The last group, and this is really where Hebrews is going towards. The last group who don't benefit from a feast. Does anyone know who this is? Those of you alive in the 50s, you guys remember Baby Huey, the cartoon and the comic, right? He was the perpetual 2-year-old that if he walked on this stage, he'd fall through it because he was 7 feet tall and 500 pounds, he'd fall through, right? So Baby Huey always had Mama and Papa, and they'd always have to pick him up, and they were deadlifting. You could see the dad, you could see Papa down there. He had the Irish dad, and Papa would always be sweating and irritated that Baby Huey wanted to follow him around. But this image this was the front of a comic. I think this comic's from about 1952, and it's interesting because what you have is Baby Huey, who's twice the size of his father, probably 3 times the size of his father. And what's Dad doing? He's got a giant bottle on a pulley. So Mom's not there. Otherwise, they'd both be doing it. But, Baby Huey, even though he could avoid the fox would always try to eat Baby Huey in the cartoons. And the fox would hit Baby Huey with an axe, and the axe head would split because he was bulletproof, Even though he could do all these other things, he could never feed himself, and it was really those who refused to advance beyond being fed. And that was the issue with Baby Huey. You never really knew how old he was. The mom always claimed he was 2, but he was 2, those of you alive in the 50s, he was 2 from about 1950 to about 1962, right? As the cartoons were out there and the comics were out there, he was perpetually 2 years old. And this is the group that both the writer of Hebrews, and we're going to see this, he's being very specific in the metaphor he uses. But the group that he's talking to is a group who refuses to advance beyond being fed. So instead of eating on their own, they refuse to advance beyond this state. Okay? And I'm not talking about wearing bonnets and diapers, but having someone actually strain and labor to feed them because they refuse to essentially pick up the spoon. Has anyone ever heard this phrase? People that bounce from church to church, have you heard that people say this? I have. I said it in my younger years. I would say, well, we need to go do this. I'm not being fed. What's wrong with that statement? If I back up and go back to that feast picture, whose job is it to do the feeding when you're sitting at the table? Your own. You see that? The primary job when you're sitting at a feast and you have a spread laid before you like this, the primary job of the person at the table is to take the food and feed themselves with it. I know this sounds like very elementary in its understanding, but the writer of Hebrews is using this on purpose, and he's not the only one that uses it. We're going to see that. He's not the only one that uses this imagery of literally a feast being in front of you, which we're going to see as the oracles of God, and they're waiting for someone to literally put it in a pulley. So let's skip forward here. We got a gluten-free boy here. We've got bottle kids. We've got Baby Huey, right? They're waiting for someone to package it in the bottle and hand it to them. Not only hand it to them, not even grab the bottle, have it put in their mouth. It's the most passive form. This is 1 degree away from an IV in the arm, right? At least the mouth's still involved. It's not going directly into your blood veins. And that is today in modern society, especially in evangelical society, really encompassed by this phrase, I'm not being fed. And you know what? As long as you stay in that passive statement, this is really a combination of 1 and 2, right? Someone who refuses to not be passively fed, okay? But this idea this passive statement, I'm going to propose to you that if that's part of your mentality today, you will never be satisfied. And there is so much in the scriptures that cannot be covered until you learn to take the spoon for yourself. Okay? We're going to go through this because this is one of the reasons we did Living by the Book. Those of you in the groups, it was to make that transition over to what the writer of Hebrews is actually getting at. People think he was trying to convey theology. That's not exactly what he was doing. He's actually trying to teach them to stand on their own 2 feet. This really defines what discipleship is and how the first century church was supposed to operate as opposed to what they were doing in certain cases. But the hard part is that now, in this country especially, this is becoming the defining statement of what churches do. Like how they react is they hear, I'm not being fed, well, we have to do this. That's not the heart of the problem. So let's keep going. So I went and looked up, I'm not being fed. I literally typed this into YouTube and Google just to see what videos would pop up. And I'm not going to show the videos, for copyright reasons, but I did pull the titles, okay? Now, what's interesting about this, these are both now Protestant and Catholic, okay? So these just came as they came down the order of the hits, with the search engine optimization. I got Protestant and Catholic videos on how to make sure that people are passively fed. And it was amazing. And so these are just the names of them. What are you being fed at church? See the passive statement, being fed. It's not what are you eating at church. What are you not being fed by your church? What do you do when you're not being fed at your church? I'm not being fed in church, a quick take. And are you being fed at church? What do you see that is the correlating ideas here, the correlating things between being fed? Is it from the scriptures, or what does it say? Getting fed at church, right? So what is the job in this? What is the onus put upon to feed the people? The church. As we go forward in Hebrews, we're going to see that the church facilitates the food. It is not, and let me repeat this over and over again, I'll say this ad nauseum, it is not the church's job to passively feed the saints. It's the church's job, as Paul says, to equip the saints so that you can stand on your own 2 feet. That's harder. That takes time, it's harder, but that's the actual job statement. When Paul says, I gave, in Acts 20, when he's talking to the church of Ephesus, and says, I gave you the full counsel of God. I didn't hold back from giving you the full counsel of God. It wasn't to spoon feed it in their mouth. He's giving them the counsel, and they're expected as disciples to take that in. The other word for disciple is student or apprentice in Greek. As students, they take it in. But it is not the job of the church. This is a misnomer that has come out, and it's about a century old in the United States now. This is not something that the contemporary Christian movement came up with. They usually get hung for this. This is about a century old. It really has to do with the Protestant service as we know of it now. But this idea of being fed from the teacher doing the work and passing it on as just information, where I have done the eating and I'm the food critic that's telling you what the experience was like, that is not my job as a teacher. My job is to show you the hermeneutic, the way to interpret so that you can go off and do it on your own. This is passive feeding. And this is a term, passive feeding. I had to look these up this week. I had to look and see what RNs call these things in the medical world and all of this. This is passive feeding. And this is where he sets the stage for his allegory. Or not allegory, metaphor, I'm sorry. So passive feeding. So this is just a Google definition, but I want you to follow what I'm talking about here. Passive feeding, and this is just like with babies, a situation where an individual or an organism relies on external forces to provide nourishment or information. rather than actively seeking or creating it. A baby, a newborn baby, they are 100% reliant upon mom or dad or whoever's caring for them to convey the food to them, actually feed it to them, right? They cannot actively seek it. They certainly can't create it. You've never seen a newborn baby that is a chef like Emerald, right? They can't create the food. So it's this kind of idea. This is passive feeding. Sometimes they'll say when the baby starts actually eating out of the bottle, that becomes active, but it's still a form of passive feeding, and it's active eating, but they're not actually going out and actively seeking or creating it. This is passive feeding. Passive feeding is what the writer of Hebrews is equating to passive learning. And so that's really what he's getting at. Passive learning, now this is just another definition, is consuming content, okay? Our public schools are struggling with this in the U.S., by the way. No, I'm serious. Active versus passive learning. It's so much cheaper and more turnkey to have a passive learning model, and we're going to see why. Those of you in education, you can probably vouch for this. But passive learning, consuming content without actively engaging, so there's no back and forth in a creative or interactive process. And it's marked by consumption over interaction. Okay, so it's a one-way consuming model of learning. The metaphor that the writer of Hebrews gives, he says it's like eating this way, where you're laying on your back like, this is a much cuter illustration of baby Huey, right? Is that the baby's laying on its back and it's just being fed. And the writer of Hebrews is actually trying to equate the concept of passive learning with the limitations of doing that in discipleship with the idea of passive eating. It's marked by consuming over interacting. This is really important. When it comes to your own sanctification and discipleship, this is really important. So passive reading versus active reading. So if we have a text like the Bible, okay, and you use the text in a passive reading, i.e. passive learning format versus active, this is the difference between active and passive reading. And I pulled this right off an education site. Active reading, so when you pull open a book, it doesn't matter if it's the Bible or a general text. Active reading is a more engaged approach. You have to engage yourself with the text. That involves interacting with the text, while passive reading is a more relaxed, less engaged approach. There are genres of literature today that are written to be 100% passive. So the cheap fiction novels that you could almost turn them on Audible, and it wouldn't matter if you're reading the book or listening to the book, that's more of a passive form of literature. The Bible is not passive literature. If you think it is, I want to know what book you're reading, because I need to really dig into that. I have not found a piece of passive literature in the Bible yet. The Torah the book of Moses is about 60% narrative. That's probably the closest thing you could equate to passive reading, but the other 40% kind of throw the wrench into the gears where you can't read it passively. It's not possible. If you pick up something like the book of Psalms or Proverbs, good luck reading that passively. It forces you to think. That's what wisdom literature does. Active reading enhances comprehension, retention, and this is the most important thing, critical thinking skills. If you have a discipleship model that doesn't force you to critically think, if you actually place yourself in a church that doesn't advocate critical thinking of the text to where you actually get something out of it and you can actually iterate it back to another person, you're in a passive learning environment. And the writer of Hebrews, and we're going to see that Paul, both say that's not good. That is not how, even in Jewish culture, that is not how you learn. Even today, that's not how you learn, especially at the time of the temple. So those of you in Living by the Book, now I want to point this out because as I was going through looking at active and passive learning, what has overtaken the church in the United States especially, but really in Britain too in the 1920s, leading up to present day, is a passive learning model. And so you can see it in the kind of literature that's sold or bought or exchanged, that sort of thing. What's popular in literature, that's really indicative of what, people are studying. And living by the book. Now, those of you who went through the course, is that passive learning or is that active? That's really active, right? Like Dr. Hendricks, prof from Dallas, forces you, not at a seminary level, it's an entry-level book for the new enrollees at Dallas. That's really why he wrote it with his son. And so that idea is just to get the person coming off the street from potentially a secular university that is now just, beaming with passive learning. Basically, your professor tells you what you're supposed to not just think, but believe as well, right? And they attack your belief system while you're there. If you're coming out of that environment and you enroll yourself in Dallas Theological Seminary, there's going to be a problem your first year. It's that time of transition where you have your professors trying to advocate for active learning in the text, and you just came out of 4 to 5 years of passive learning, especially from a liberal university. And Dr. Hendricks knew that was a problem. He could see it early on in his teaching at Dallas. And so what was his original studying the Bible class became this living by the book. That's why we did it. Now you would think that as popular as that is, the book has been around since 1990, 91. As popular as that is amongst the Christian Academy, you would think that people would be kicking the door down to learn to study God's Word that way. Okay? Across, close to just shy of 40 years, Moody Press has sold about 300,000 copies. That's pretty good. I'm going to show you an example of passive learning. Some of you may have read this, but the reason I'm putting it up here is because it set the stage for successive literature coming after it. Okay? I'm not dogging this. I need you to understand that the nature of this book, okay, is such that the things that came after it became more and more passive. Does anyone know what this book is? Oh, I hear the voices. Okay, so everyone knows what this is. Utmost for his highest. Oswald Chambers, one of the top-selling pieces of literature in recorded history. It's not as high as Pilgrim's Progress, but when it comes to the English language, it has sold millions. It says over 13 million sold. What kind of literature is this? Is it active or passive? Overly passive. It set the stage, and it's not just this text. This text was first printed in Britain in 1927, and then it came to America, I think I read 1935. So think about it. The idea of devotion culture, the point of diving into God's Word is to, and this was the model, open the Bible, open the devotion, and then read what the person is saying about the text. Is 100 years old now. It's reached a century. So I'm not surprised when I think about this, that since 1927 at a minimum, it's really before that, it's probably post-Civil War in this nation, that passive learning models have just overtaken active learning. It happened in the schools. It happened in the churches. I'm not surprised to hear I'm not being fed on a regular basis, because why? For 100 years in this country, the church has just bought into that. That's not a contemporary Christian thing. That is I need to be fed God's Word with a spoon from somebody else, whether it's someone who writes a book like this or the local clergy. And you have drifters who go from church to church looking for clergy that do that, and they think that's the clergy's job. And that just baffles my mind because, 30 minutes in the New Testament, and you see that that's not what Paul was doing. He's making convincing arguments to people. He's trying to convince the rabbis that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, while at the same time saying, you're new believers, I need to walk you through what you just said you believe. Come here. It says it for 3 weeks in one place when Paul's on his mission, for 3 solid weeks, not just on Shabbat, every day he was having to educate people. That was his job every day. There's no way that you go, think about this. Acts chapter 20 says Paul preached and taught the full counsel of God to the Ephesian church in 3 years. The whole thing in 3 years. The men on the road to Emmaus received illumination from the Messiah himself about the law, prophets, and writings in about a 2-hour walk. Do you think that was passive and they just sat and listened? Or do you think they asked questions? This is really important to understand why Jesus says make disciples and what that means. So passive feeding equals passive learning in Hebrews. We just looked at this definition. Another definition, now it's not a big leap to get over to this other one. Passive learning of consuming content is also the model of passive entertainment. When I worked in marketing, we actually talked about active marketing versus passive marketing. So in the industry that I used to work in, if we had a range event and you went out and you got to shoot the product and we went out and had hunting gear for you and all that stuff, what kind of marketing is that? That's active. If you're sitting back watching YouTube, guess what that is? It's passive. So the marketing industry does this, and they have to define, we're going to spend so much millions of dollars on the active marketing versus the passive marketing. And a lot more, I can tell you from firsthand experience, a lot more is dumped into the passive entertainment marketing than the active. Less people involved, you film one video, and you just basically dump the rest of your funds into ad campaigns, search engine optimization, all of this stuff. So the world we live in, if you have a passive, now follow me here, if you have a passive learning model in the church, how do they do outreach? Passive entertainment, because they've been wedded together in this country. So passive entertainment, consuming, now this is another one I just pulled right off the internet. Consuming content without actively engaging in a way that requires physical or mental exertion, marked by consumption over interaction. I was baffled that these two are so similar in their definition. So what does that look like? Well, the first thing is the world of the social media. Even though we put this out on YouTube, if someone's sitting at home trying to get their sanctification from listening to me on YouTube, you're at the infant stage. You have to be here. You have to be talking to somebody senior in the faith that can walk you down the path. Their job's not just to answer questions, it's to get you thinking so that you'll walk further down the path. That's what it means to walk in the Messiah. But this world, and I put Neo up here from The Matrix, right, is that the idea of him being plugged in the back of his head and he's sitting back in the barber chair or the therapist chair is what it looks like, and he's just getting plugged in of all this information. That's the passive entertainment model, is whether they're educating or entertaining, the passive model is you sit back and you get fed. And what they have found, church, is that the more that passive learning and passive education, and those of you in education can vouch for this, the more of that happens, do you think the literacy rate goes up or down? It goes down. If you're passively taught math on YouTube, guess how good your math skills are? You have to take out a piece of paper or something to copy what the person on YouTube does, right? Yesterday, I was changing an alternator in a car. I had to watch the YouTube video, but then guess what I had to do? Change the alternator, right? I actually had to go, okay, now that's the active learning where it's requiring mental and physical exertion. And so I have instruction, but I just don't sit back and watch an alternator getting changed in a Subaru Forester and it all of a sudden gets changed in my car, right? That is active learning, and it's a key difference. What kind of model is this, active or passive? How much active learning, now think about this, if you have 20,000 people in a room and you have one teacher, how much interaction is the person in the nosebleed section going to have with the teacher to advance in their faith? Slim to none. You see that? You would need, for a crowd that big, you would need 200 trained elders even to start like eating the elephant one bite at a time to advance people in their discipleship. And so this is a very, very, very passive model. But like I said, it didn't originate in this passive entertainment model in what we see in Christianity today. It started in our literature 100 years ago. It's been a very, no pun intended, a very passive conditioning of our society. It's unfortunate because when we get into Hebrews, he's trying to actually steer them off this path, is that we should have learned 2,000 years ago, we didn't. We just found a new expression of it. So David Wells, this is a book called The Courage to be Protestant. And the reason I brought this in here is because you know who, when they're looking at age groups that are actually chasing after the marketing-based church models, you know that age keeps getting older and older and older? It's now like age 45 plus that's chasing that because they grew up being marketed via television. So they do that because it's something they're culturally affiliated with. You know what the young Gen Zers are doing? They're abandoning it. They're abandoning it. And this David Wells, he said, the courage to be Protestant, he summarized it very well. The marketing church, now this is, I'm trying to get to the root of this because it's behind the marketing church is the passive learning model, has calculated that unless it makes deep, serious cultural adaptations, okay, it will go out of business. So you have to chase what is passive, especially with the younger generations. What it has not considered carefully enough is that it may well be putting itself out of business with God. Because is that how we're supposed to learn according to what the scriptures say about themselves? Absolutely not. This is really important, church. Deep study is not limited to the seminary. And the further irony is that the younger generations who are less impressed, now this is the Gen Zers and younger now, less impressed by whiz-bang technology, who often see through what is slick and glitzy, and who have been on the receiving end of enough marketing to nauseate them, are as likely to walk away from these oh-so-relevant churches as to walk into them. What are these kids looking for? They've said, we've been marketed everything at this point. The Gen Zers grew up in a time where the iPhone has been a reality the entire time. They make jokes about rotary telephones. Now, I'm not so young that I don't remember the rotary telephone, and we were at dinner at some friend's house last night. I was talking about me and my brother taking the long cord from the rotary telephone and playing jump rope with it. And then I was reminded that the other cool thing to do with the long phone cords was to wrap yourself in it like this. And what you do if you're the older brother is you take the phone receiver, wrap it around the back, and leave him there. And wait till mom gets home. But this younger generation, the culture they're in is so passive. Everything's marketed to them to where they're tired of it. And what has happened, church, unfortunately, they're not going into Bible-confessing churches that have deep teaching. You want to know why? Because they're few and far between now. The evangelical Bible churches have gone down this road. And you know where they're going? Historical Protestant churches. They're going back to the liturgical age because they're looking for something that is ancient and timeless. Because they see the ages changing. Every 6 months, a new idea comes out, right? It's either politics or politics in marketing. And so they're getting just all this stuff thrown at them, and they're going into liturgical churches that don't even really teach the Bible because they're just trying to find something timeless. Something that precedes them. And they're smart enough, the iPhone, unfortunately, gives them the information of when this model in American evangelicalism started, and they know that it doesn't go before really the 20th century. Maybe the literature does, but this model's not old. So they go back and look at the Anglican Church and Henry and the Tudors, and then they go, and some of them are joining the RCC. But why is it? They're not looking for what that has to offer. They're not looking for the doctrine. They're just looking to have something that is consistent and that brings them into something deeper than the surfacey world that they have around them. where they're trying to get you to buy in. So who benefits from a feast? Who's the only person that really benefits from a feast? All right? A person who knows how to eat and takes full advantage of it. They're the ones that benefit from a feast. We cannot continue, we, the church in the U.S., we cannot continue down the road of this and expect depth. And I've seen people just drift. Anywhere we've ever lived, I've seen people drift from church to church to church because they think that the model that Jesus Christ set up is this surfacey model where you sit back and you just consume. That is not indicative of the church. That's not even indicative of the medieval church. You still had to go to Mass. Those who know how to eat, those who take full advantage of it. The timelessness of our faith, and this is really what the writer of Hebrews is trying to get at. The timelessness of our faith. Brett McCracken said this, and it's an article that came out in 2020. He wrote a book called Hipster Christianity in 2012. And those of you who remember the COVID pandemic, churches were shutting down left and right. They were shutting down everywhere. And a lot of them were big mega churches that should have enough, stability to keep going. They shut down. It was big and small. But he said this because he saw them all shutting down, and we saw things in the SBC and the news, if you follow like Christian news and that sort of thing. But he said relevance-focused Christianity, this was a thesis statement, relevance-focused Christianity sows the seeds of its own obsolescence. So if that's your mentality, guess what? In 6 months, you're irrelevant again. There's no timelessness in that. In 3 years, you'll be irrelevant again. And so you're always chasing it's like the carrot in front of a horse. You're always chasing the new thing. There's no timelessness in that model. Because if it was timeless, now follow me on this. If it was timeless, can you have a shallow teacher or teachers? No, because they have to be rooted in the timelessness of the faith. This is why it can't be limited to the Christian Academy. And that's what we've done, is we've actually put the deep thoughts into the Christian Academy and said, we'll keep the shallowness here. We'll put the deep thoughts over there, and maybe someday the pastor will get to convey it to you on a rare occasion. This is always marked by passive learning, combined now with passive entertainment, right? Consumer marketing metrics. Those of you who work in marketing, the metrics are everything. If you have a department meeting, there's all about the latest metrics, right? So consumer analytics, all that stuff. Here's what I'm going to propose. We are inheritors of our faith. We're not innovators. We inherited this. People died for this. It's not our job to innovate. There's enough there to supply us with a lifetime of learning about who Jesus of Nazareth is, unto an eternity of his wisdom being conveyed to us past what the Bible could convey. That's the destiny you have. We have inherited this faith from the saints before us, many of whom gave their lives. Just to make sure, now think about this, just to make sure that you have a copy of the Bible sitting on your lap, they gave their lives. Do they expect you, think about this. Why would they give their lives for the Bible if it's the clergy's job? What was the big debate between the Reformation? Is it the job of who versus what? Is it the job of the clergy to convey the Bible to you, or is it your job as saints to read it yourselves? That was the whole point of the Reformation 500 years ago. That's what we're still doing and advocating for. They gave their lives for that. Not that they would survive and be the ones that are the bottleneck between you and understanding who God is. That's what they were against. It's that here, read it for yourselves. And now for some weird reason, we've reverted back to a new model of what they tried to get away from. Hebrews 11, if you have your Bibles turned, or Hebrews 5, verses 11 through 14. This is the thesis statement of the author. Why am I writing this and what am I doing? About this, so he just finishes talking about Jesus and Melchizedek. Those of you in the Living by the Book study, that was your passage, right? About this, we have much to say, and it is interpretively difficult to explain, since you have become sluggish in hearing. Sometimes it says dull. It actually means like sluggish or lazy with your ears. They want to go deeper than what Hebrews conveys, but they can't. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, and teachers is literally those who convey doctrine. You need someone to teach you again the beginning principles of the oracles of God. That word oracles can also be rendered utterances. You need milk, not solid food. What is the key problem here? Is it the content? No, he's saying I have to give you milk because you cannot feed yourself. If I take you any further than this, you don't know how to eat on your own. That's the problem. It's not that it's milk. Adults can drink milk. You know, I'm one of those weirdos that still drinks milk in my adulthood. Right? There you go. I see that hand.
With chocolate.
With chocolate, yep. That's another thing you do when you have a brother. You convince your younger brother that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. Then they believe you. Then you get grounded because they go out and, to the cow, especially if you're on a farm. So you need milk, not solid food. This is not a case of the content that they're getting conveyed. He's saying they can't feed themselves. They don't know how to eat yet. They should, but they're like baby Huey. They're sitting back waiting to be fed again as adults. These are seasoned believers. They've been around a while. And if it's writing to the Hebrews, guess what they were raised in? The scriptures from childhood, and he's writing, this is a strong rebuke. If you think about this being a group of Jewish recipients, they should know. And he's saying, I have to take you back through the beginning principles of the utterances of God. What does that say about Hebrews? All of it is what? Is there any meat in there? There's not an ounce of meat in the book of Hebrews. As deep as we may think it is, the book in its entirety is a letter of milk. Just to get them primed for the deep things that are in the Bible. And I'm telling you, church, there are such deep things in the scriptures. There's stuff around the holidays that it would literally take 3 hours to convey one holiday to you on the things that Jesus does and the things he's yet to do. And it's just wrapped up in there. I mean, throughout my week in the office, that's usually what people come in and talk about. And those are the best times because you can sit there and exchange back and forth. And that's really what the early church did. Continuing in verse 13. For everyone, and this is the giveaway, everyone who partakes of milk is unskillful, sometimes it says inexperienced, in the word of righteousness, since he is an infant. So though we think Hebrews is deep today, part of that might be indicative of the culture that we were raised in this country. If you were raised in evangelical culture, this is considered meat to us in relation to what we have been getting fed. And that's a problem. As you're discipling others, those of you that teach, as you're discipling others, if this is milk, what is the shallow gospel that we're hearing around today? It's sugar water in relation to what Hebrews is saying. The perspective of this book, this letter being deep, is it's really subjective based upon how much of an infant in the faith are you. It's truly who's holding the spoon. Are you holding the spoon or is someone else? But solid food is for the mature. That can also mean it's teleos. So it can also be complete, full grown. The ones who by constant use, now look at that, constant use have exercised, and he does a play on words here, exercise the perceptive faculties. So those who have a developed palate, he's using food language here. Those who by constant use have exercised the perceptive faculties or the senses for discerning both good and evil. Where are they supposed to discern good and evil? In the oracles of God. You see that? If they can't handle the utterances correctly, if with young believers, do they have trouble discerning which is good and which is bad? Of course they do. They're new in the faith. We're supposed to be patient with those people. That's fine. That's fine. We're supposed to walk them along in the faith. They are supposed to be drinking milk. The rebuke here is that from the oracles of God, whoever this Jewish audience was, wherever they were in the Roman Empire, they could not discern good from evil because they did not have developed senses. They didn't know good food from bad food. They didn't know Kraft mac and cheese from all the other stuff on the shelf. If you know my kids, Kraft mac and cheese is the go-to, right? They didn't know the good food from the bad. They didn't know when it was supposed to be sweet and salty versus bitter. There's times the scriptures are supposed to be bitter. There's times that they're sweet and salty. But they can't discern those things. He's still using the food language here. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 3. This is actually a case that Paul may have written in Hebrews as well. But I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as fleshly, as infants in Christ. I gave you milk to drink, not solid food. Same exact words. For you were not yet what? Able. And even now you are not able. The other letter that is milk throughout is 1 Corinthians. Why did Paul write 1 Corinthians? So that he could write 2 Corinthians. I've got to give you this foundational stuff because I'm not going to discuss the new covenant with you until you truly understand that Christ died for your sins according to the scriptures. Now we'll talk about the covenant. What does he say here? Christ died for your sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. Think about if you don't have, now this is a little cerebral, but follow me on this. If you have this statement and you get rid of accordance with the scriptures, who is Christ? It's a good question. You have nothing to fill the content of the statement with. Do you want to know how cults get started? Especially Christian derivative cults, they take that statement and fill it with other information on the back end. Plain and simple. They take what we call the kerygma, the proclamation, and it's no longer in accordance with the scriptures, it's filled with other information. This is why you cannot be a reductionist in your faith. When Jesus reduces things down to one statement, he always says you can summarize the law and the prophets with that thing. He's filling the whole scriptures behind the one statement. It's a summary statement. But it still has to have the scriptures and the study of them behind it. Got to have the meal. You've got to dive into the food. And as you dive into the food, guess what happens to this statement? It becomes so much richer. It becomes this one sentence that has so much hope wrapped up in it just by default of the word Christ, of the Messiah, that the death of him means so much more to you than anybody else could in history. That's a faith that you'd give your life for. You want to know why the Reformers said the Bible needs to go forward at the expense of our own lives if needs be? Because that's what's in there. It gives us the substance. So the goal of Hebrews, this is the goal of the book, conveying the beginning principles. of the utterances of God. Plain and simple. Hebrews, as a letter, is milk. And as you understand that that's milk, guess what? If this is milk, guess how much cool stuff is buried inside the scriptures to be pursued after this? A whole lot. And you'll never get it from me. I'll advocate up here, you have to go home and read yourselves. When people call me and say, I have to go home and read my Bible after one of your sermons, okay, great. I did my job. If you went home and did nothing for 6 days until you come back, I'm not doing my job. That's not our goal. Hebrews is milk. It's to set the stage so you can pursue those deeper things. Why? To prepare the unskillful with an introduction so that this is the most important word, they're able. It's to enable the saints to seek out deeper things, the food within the oracles. Sometimes we jump ahead. We'll dive into commentaries and see what someone else says about the text. Church, that is like reading a restaurant reviewer. Someone has done the eating for you. You have consumed nothing. You're just reading about what someone else did. It's great for confirming, like, did I taste bitter? Did I taste sweet? Did I taste salty? And you read this guy and he goes, well, what I tasted was coffee beans. Well, then I must be off, or, we had a different dish. But the commentaries are even the passive learning sometimes. And we dive into those and we look at other people's eating conclusions. But you're not actually consuming. You're not eating. And I'll tell you, church, once you start getting into deep eating of food, you'll want more. It won't be enough. It will not be enough. The Spirit will make sure of that. That's one of his jobs. It's not milk versus meat. The purpose of Hebrews is not milk versus meat. Okay? This could be said of 1 Corinthians as well. It's not milk versus meat. It's unskillfulness versus ability. It's not having the skill versus being able. Let's pray together. Lord, we love you. Lord, let us have that desire. I pray that your Spirit convicts everyone here, that they have the burn in order to pursue your scriptures. I pray that their hearts burn in the same way that when your Messiah conveyed things to Clopas and Simon, that they said, did not our hearts burn when he spoke to us about these things? May their hearts burn when they open your text and understand that what's in front of them are your utterances and your oracles. The secrets that you have conveyed to humanity, the things we longed for, you have conveyed to us, and we have a blessed hope in that that's not all, because our eternity with you is to sit and listen and experience and be filled with your wisdom. That is part of worshiping you. Lord, let us not be shallow. Let us not be babies. Let us understand that this is milk and that we get tired of the milk and want to go deeper. Lord, I pray that we get so attached to what is in this letter that we go, oh, this is a pathway that I want to go further down. Lord, give us that drive. I ask this in your Son's name. Amen.